And hello again, it's Brother John again, and we're going to do a teaching on the book of Joshua and look at some of the things that Joshua did. Let us begin today with a Bible reading. We will take Joshua chapter 1 verse 9. Joshua chapter 1 verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Wonderful reading. It's from the first part of the story. As we discussed last time, Joshua was Moses' successor. He took over, and Moses, who could not enter the promised land, Joshua led the campaign to capture the promised land. I just want to kill some audio here. So, Joshua takes over. Now, it was a very difficult thing to conquer. It wasn't easy. They had to drive out a race of people called the Canaanites. And we're going to look at what he said. In chapter 1, verse 7, he speaks to the people about their morale, their courage. That's the first thing we need if we're going to be in a fight, is we need to have courage. It's a scary, tough world out there, brothers and sisters. So these people had to be courageous. Not all of them were going to survive. Not all of them were going to make it through. And God did not just do it all for them. We see the issue of morality arrives. They have to be honest, and that would catch them out. They were not honest in one of the cases, and things backfired when they behaved like that in a dishonest way. And he puts the questions to the people. Will you be courageous? As we read in the reading, will you be upright? And the people answered him in verse 17 of chapter 1, and they said, we will obey you just as we obeyed Moses. Now sometimes that might even elicit a bit of a giggle from us, because we know from the story they gave Moses a very hard time through the wandering in the wilderness. It was not an easy ministry for him. But the people committed themselves, and so they go ahead with the campaign. When we come to the crossing of the Jordan, there's a few things we must realize as Christians, especially as we start to study it, is that the crossing of the Jordan almost always represents, has something miraculous in it when the Jordan is crossed, and that works for both testaments. Think of some of the old traditional hymns that people sing, one day when I cross the Jordan River. It speaks of death, life and death, and it's about being, in this case, they're going to become a new nation if we look at the events that are about to transpire. We can think about it in terms of Elijah and Elisha's journey. It's a future teaching we're going to do. Crossing the Jordan, when Elijah was taken up to heaven and his life was over on earth. Joshua 3 verse 16, not to be confused with John 3:16, but Joshua 3:16, it says it happens, these events happen across the Jordan from Jericho. They were on the east side, and Jericho is on the west side of the Jordan. And it says it happens near the city of Jericho. Now that's interesting, because in the Bible, in the New Testament, it says John the Baptist was ministering at the Jordan, and it speaks about, in John 1 verse 28, it speaks about Bethany. And if we examine a map, we see that Jericho and Bethany are actually very close to each other. So they were where he crosses the Jordan, where Joshua takes the nation across, and where John the Baptist was baptizing and preparing the way for Jesus. And that we must just put that aside in your mind. They happen very close, possibly on the same spot, even though they're separated by centuries and centuries. And since we know nothing happens in the Bible by coincidence, there's something to bear in mind. When Joshua takes the nation across, they take the Ark of the Covenant into the Jordan. And the Bible say the waters part. Speaks about an interesting place we can't go into today, City Adam, and it speaks about the Dead Sea. That's where the waters backed up. And we know that when Jesus entered the river Jordan to be baptized by John the Baptist, the heavens part. So we see reflections and foreshadowings of themes, Old and the New Testament, playing with each other. We see a lot of symbolism on top of each other, and we'll come back to that at the end of the sermon. There's a lot here. So one of these teachings you might have to watch through 2 or 3 times to get all the points. That where the waters part for Joshua and where the heavens part for Jesus, it's a very close, very similar place. Joshua says lay 12 stones in Joshua 4 verses 8 to 9. It speaks about Joshua laying 12 stones as a memorial to the 12 tribes of Israel, who the original people who perished in the wilderness, in the wandering. And it's very interesting because it's at the more or less the same space where John the Baptist in Matthew 3 verse 9 speaks about God could turn the stones into sons of Abraham if he chose. Who knows, maybe he was standing on or indicating the same stones. Very interesting symbolism on top of each other, the Old and the New Testament playing with each other. God chose this new generation to take this new mission. He actually left the old generation behind. They died in the desert. Only Joshua and Caleb came through to start this new phase, this new taking of the promised land. And they begin at a place called Gilgal, where we will visit again in a future sermon about Elijah and Elisha. They start there, and that's where Joshua circumcises the people. That's an important point, brothers and sisters. That these people were not circumcised out in the wilderness with the people Moses led. That circumcision had already been instituted, but these people were circumcised in the new land. It's a new generation. It's a new mindset for a new mission. They leave behind the old things. It says there in the Bible that they ate the produce of the land. That day the manna stopped. We know that they were fed manna in the wilderness. That they found every morning, they collected the manna. But that day they ate the produce of the land. Gilgal, as we said, is the first stop on the journey of Elijah and Elisha, and it's the place where there's commitment. Around this time, it's interesting that Joshua meets an angel who introduces himself as the captain of the Lord's host, or it depends how your specific Bible words it. And when he asks this angel, "Are you on our side?" which we could all do. I mean, I understand asking that. I mean, who wouldn't want him? The angel says, "I'm on God's side." You see, the question, brothers and sisters, for this difficult task, for this taking of the land, the question is not if God is on Joshua's side, it is if Joshua is on God's side. And that's a question for ourselves. God is not our backup. God is not our plan B. We are either with God's mission or we're not with God's mission. And that's why the angel basically, in a sense, tosses it back to him. I'm on God's side. Question here, Joshua, is whose side are you on? Not if God is on your side. It's are you on God's side with God's mission? The first stop they come to is, of course, we know Jericho. Hopefully all of us who were raised in churches as children know that one from Sunday school. Jericho and the walls of Jericho. And there they meet Rahab, the harlot. Now, brothers and sisters, many things. First of all, the plan they use. They go to a brothel. They sneak in. And they meet Rahab, who's a downcast member of society. She's a prostitute with limited means and options in society. She's making her living as best she can. And she conspires with them and hides the spies and lets the spies escape. Brothers and sisters, that is just basic espionage 101. It's basic espionage. You don't go with a hood over your head and sneak around the enemy headquarters or the enemy parliament or that. That's how you get captured and tortured to death. You go through the malcontents of a society and you find your way in places like that. And they find this woman. I don't need to elaborate on the technical things. And she helps them. We know the red cord out the window. And they tell her, hang a red cord for when we invade the city, we'll know. Yes, if you've guessed, it is a reference to the blood of Christ. It's what saves her. You could reference it back to the Passover, to the lamb's blood on the doors. It's a similar thing, and she's saved by something which represents the blood of Christ. And she becomes an ancestor of David, who in turn becomes an ancestor of Jesus, this woman. Jericho is perhaps the oldest city on earth. It depends. Some historians say Damascus, some say Jericho. It's definitely a strong contender for the oldest city on earth. It appears in things like Jesus' parable about a man who takes a journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. We know King David, when he fled from Jerusalem to Jericho. In the story of Elijah and Elisha, we'll see how it represents sin, stronghold of sin. It represents warfare. It is the first stop on the crucifixion week, when Jesus also crosses the Jordan in a similar place and heads to Jerusalem to be crucified. He stops at Jericho. The marching and the blowing of horns. Now, there can be technical, physical explanations for what happened, the marching around, the blowing of horns. People have explained this scientifically, how it can cause walls to collapse. I don't mind that. We embrace that. But today we want to point out a thing in Joshua 6 verse 26. When the city was destroyed, two things. They were told not to loot the city. They could loot all the other cities they conquered, but not to loot Jericho. They were warned not to do it. And people did it. People kept the loot. God said, all the other cities are yours, the first. It's like the principle of the first fruits, the sacrifice of the first fruits. It's the first city, this one is mine. And they were warned not to rebuild the city. In 1 Kings 16 verse 36, we see Jericho is rebuilt. And they were warned, you will, at its foundations, you will bury your firstborn, and at the walls, you will bury your eldest son. And we see that happens, that curse comes true in 1 Kings 16 verse 34. And read those verses, we'll see. And the people don't listen. They loot, and later that's not important. And in the next battle at the city of Ai, however you want to pronounce that, they are defeated. Second battle into their campaign, they are defeated. And Joshua has to start what we can consider history's first investigation, to find out why. And we see that the culprit is found. So they're able to put themselves back on track. They have a hiccup, but they put themselves back on track. Two things, brothers and sisters. First of all is the humility. They realized they did a mistake. Joshua led the people, and they repented, and they punished the wrongdoers among them. And the second thing is, if we read the story about the taking of the city of Ai, is that Joshua used brilliant strategy. Similar to the issue of the angel, God is not our backup. God is not our weapon to wield. We are on God's side, He is not on our side. And they use strategy to win. It's quite brilliant. We don't really have the time to go into it and make the teaching very complicated. But it's something you can read, how they draw them out and defeat them. After that, they go to Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Now, we've discussed that in detail in an earlier sermon. That's where Joshua pronounces the blessings and the curses. There's the valley of Shechem. They bury the bones of Joseph there later on. It's where the well of Jacob was, the well that never ran dry. And it's where Jesus met the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. Important verse I want to take out. It says in Joshua 8 verse 35 that there was not a word of Moses that Joshua did not read there. It says in the book of Joshua. He read the whole law. He read it all. The very most famous battle of them all, or the most incredible battle, maybe not the most famous, but the incredible, is where the kings of the land get together to counterattack. You can understand that. There's a hostile foreign invader in the land, and all the kings and the tribal chieftains, the Bible says there were 5 kings who got together. Interesting point, the king of Jerusalem, his name translates as Lord of Righteousness. This king that led the counterattack. He was Adonai Melchizedek. Melchizedek we've covered in the story of Abraham who met Melchizedek. He was the king and priest of Jerusalem. And this chap is also called Melchizedek, Adonai Melchizedek, the Lord of Righteousness. Obviously, it's a blasphemous title. It is obviously what's the word escapes me now, but it's arrogance. There's hubris in it, and they lead an attack. 5, remember in the Bible, 5 meaning fellowship. The fellowship of the land comes together, and they hit Joshua with everything he's got. And it says it's a strange thing, Joshua. It says in Joshua 10 verse 14, it came a day like no other, where God heeded the word of a man, which Joshua commanded God. Now, very important thing, we haven't discussed the name of Joshua. Joshua in Hebrew is Yehoshua, beg your pardon, Yehoshua. And later on, as Hebrew develops, it becomes shortened to Yeshua. Some of us know this, and if you haven't been taught this before, I'll teach you now. We translate that into English as Jesus. Yehoshua and Yeshua were versions, well, translate into Jesus. His name was Jesus. That day, that strange day where God received a command from a man, yes, but the man's name was Jesus. And the sun stood still. We know that things happened. The sun was darkened at the crucifixion. That day, that like no other. By the way, you're welcome to research. Once again, I embrace. There are people who have researched and said there's evidence of the strange long day. It can be done measuring the stars. I don't know how they do it, but I embrace it. I don't have a problem with things like that. But we look at the spiritual side in these teachings. So they defeat the enemy. The northern campaign is much less detailed when they move into the northern parts of the land. But if we take Jerusalem out the equation, Joshua doesn't conquer Jerusalem. He might defeat the king of Jerusalem. We can see that the campaign, the map of the campaign, does roughly seem to foreshadow the ministry of Jesus. Joshua seems to conquer the land more or less in the same order where Jesus moved through the land and ministered. It's an interesting thing. As I said, we have lots of symbolism packed on top of each other. Feel free to watch the sermon more than once to pick it all up. The story moves to Joshua's final hours. Chapter 23 and 24 are dedicated to his final hours. Like Jesus, Joshua, whose name means Jesus, does not appoint a successor. And he addresses elders, very much like the early church. It's almost like the model is. There's just a shadow of the model of the church. And he speaks to the elders. In Joshua 23, verse 6 to 9, he reminds them of the covenant they made, the covenant that they read at Shechem by the well of Jacob, where Jesus would meet the Samaritan woman. In Joshua 10, from verse 10, he reminds them of the blessings and curses. Again, he says there are blessings and curses. From chapter 24, he gives all credit to God for their victory, for taking this country. Joshua 24, from verse 2 to 3, Joshua does an interesting thing. He lays out their history. But if you read it, brothers and sisters, whatever version of the Bible, he reads it, he lays it out in prophecy format. He lays out history, but he lays it out like a prophecy, like he's prophesying the future. It tells us, it teaches us that Joshua wanted these people to know that this was ordained by God, that God has laid this out. This was God's plan for them. Chapter 24, verse 29 says that Joshua is buried in the hill country of Ephraim, and in verse 32 it says Joseph's bones are buried at Shechem. We keep discussing it. At the well of Jacob, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman, where they pronounced the blessings and curses when they first entered the land. Symbolism on top of each other, brothers and sisters. And there he's buried. A question to be asked is, why of all the people, these Canaanite people, were the only people in the Bible that God said must be wiped out? He never said it to the Assyrians. He never said it about the Persians, the Amalekites, the Edomites, the Babylonians. They were the only people. It's believed that they were the last people on earth, and I will leave this open-ended, that still had some of the Nephilim in them from Genesis 6. It's just a question that gets asked. It's something that might appear in the comments. Why were they so cruel? Why did they wipe these people out? And an answer is that they said the last of them, they even spoke about a chap named King Og of Bashan, that he was the last Nephilim, or the last person who had some of that in him. It's an interesting thing beyond the scope, a very complicated, controversial teaching, but it's worth mentioning. This is the only time in Scripture where God commanded a people be wiped out. It's frightening, but something we must learn and embrace too. Joshua 24 verse 15 is a verse that all teachings on Joshua in pulpits end on, where he said, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." He told the people to pick. He said, pick. As for me and my household, we'll serve the Lord. I'd like to end us back on chapter 1. I'd like to go back to the beginning and end us on verse 9, where it says that, "Be courageous and be upright, and remember that God is always with you." Brothers and sisters, in your life still, you might be in for the fight of your life. There may be much struggles like these people. Who knows what God will command you yet to do? Be courageous and upright, because what we do is ordained by God, as Joshua taught the people. What we do has consequences, like they learned at Jericho and Ai. And God can overcome great enemies if we are on His side, like when the 5 kings stood against them. Until next time, amen, and God bless you, and we'll meet again.